opportunity to again focus on Le Corbusier's highly original thinking, his problem-solving solutions, and his personal reinterpretation of history. We're beginning this evening with William Curtis, and later on in the week, on Wednesday and Friday in the afternoons, there will be Le Corbusier films on video set up here in the main space. Then next Monday, on March 16th, Mohan Sharma, who was the chief architect of Chandigarh and who worked closely with Corbu from the city's inception and continued to guide its growth and development for 29 years, will lecture perhaps for the first time in the United States. Also, Jeffrey Baker, who many of you will remember from previous visits, will be in residence from March 16th through the 20th, giving afternoon lectures at 2 o'clock Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and one evening lecture on Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. We invite you to participate in these events during this special series. Our speaker this evening studied at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and Harvard. He has taught the history of architecture and theory of design at universities in England, the United States, Australia, and Asia. His books include Modern Architecture Since 1900, which we use heavily in our architectural history classes, and for which he was awarded the Hitchcock Medal of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain in 1984, and the Founders Award of the American Society of Architectural Historians, and the French Critics Award, all for this same book, and a new book on Le Corbusier, and let's see, Bill, what is the title of that book? Le Corbusier, Ideas and Form, and it should be at Hennessy and Ingalls now. We're certainly going to acquire it for our library here at SCI-Arc. 2 years ago, when William Curtis spoke on Le Corbusier here at SCI-Arc, the auditorium was packed, and we all spoke of his returning soon. So that when I began to plan this series last year, I immediately thought of him, and we started a dialogue through letters, mental telepathy, and cables back and forth from India, where he was living at that time. And I'm delighted to say that everything fell into place, and Mr. Curtis is here with us tonight to open our Le Corbusier Centenary Series. Please welcome William Curtis.
Yeah, can you hear? This thing is, I'll hold it like this, it's easier.
It does clip on here. See this? There.
Right. I'll have to do it. Sorry, this is a...
Little ritual. Okay.
Right, thank you. Well, thank you for these nice words of introduction. It's always nice coming back here. I feel SCI-Arc is one of the few architecture schools which has so far avoided the problem of being overly institutionalized, and which probably manages, therefore, to concentrate from time to time on architecture, which is a rare thing for an architecture school to do these days. I want to, in this talk, investigate a particular aspect of Corbusier's work. I've given it the title, Le Corbusier, Nature and Tradition. And I must say, as a general preface to the talk, that I always hesitate very much to speak in public about Le Corbusier, because really, when you've written a book, you've suffered through the whole process of a book, You put it behind you, and then everybody else suddenly gets excited about Corbusier in 1987, and they keep asking you to come and talk and to contribute to lecture catalog, to exhibition catalogs, and you say, well, I wish to escape Le Corbusier, but then you have a sort of sense of responsibility combined with enthusiasm, actually, in the long run for the subject, and so you keep coming back. Now, in this instance, it seems to me that Corbusier, if we try and take the long view, we should pretend that we're looking back at Le Corbusier from a distance of, say, 100 years. If we do this, a whole lot of fungus falls away. There are two particular kinds of fungus which get in the way of the understanding of Le Corbusier. One is what I would call modernist fungus. Modernist fungus represents a particular version of the history of the events of the last 60 or 70 years, which tends to emphasize a particular range of issues within the history of modern architecture, concentrating on notions of functionalism and rationalism at the expense of the extremely complex mythical substructures of modern architecture, including, of course, the whole issue of the very profound debts to the past of the seminal figures of the modern movement. The other kind of fungus, and one which falls off more easily, is postmodernist fungus. This particular kind of fungus represents an attempt, an understandable attempt perhaps, at creating a propaganda, a demonology around the history of modern architecture, and blaming it in a wholesale fashion for everything that has been wrong. The danger here is that one simply lumps together every tedious glass box with Mies van der Rohe, that one blames every piece of lousy urban arrangement on Le Corbusier, as if somehow or another he had been responsible for our urban ills on his own. It's a convenient scapegoat. It's a way of avoiding testing and difficult issues about the nature of industrial society, about the real ambiguities related to so-called progress, and about the dreadful mess we make on our own without Le Corbusier. If we look at him in the longer term, it is possible that some of these distortions fall away, and it is possible that we are looking at one of the major turning points in the history of architecture. It may well be, in fact, that the developments of the 1920s and the period between the war represent one of those periods in the history of architecture where the ground rules are changed utterly, and which require perhaps centuries to be worked through as a series of implications. If we try and look at Le Corbusier in this longer way, it seems to me, curiously enough, that the issue of his modernism fades into insignificance. Certainly his great inventiveness continues to show, his astonishing panache when it comes to breaking rules and inventing another set of rules, his wit, and of course his profound penetration into the nature of society, into the nature of tradition, and into just what it constitutes to make buildings. Because when I think we look at Corbusier in this longer way, he gradually takes on the stature of a major historical figure. His works, at least the outstanding ones, take on some of the dimensions, at least, of classic works of architecture. His cousins become no longer his contemporaries, but become the ancient masters of the art of architecture. They become, in other words, the other figures in the history of architecture who, each in their own term, managed to transcend their own period and not just reproduce its stylistic formulae. So some of the things I want to say this evening are really underwritten, at least, by that point of view. And heaven knows there are many, many ways in which one could tackle that particular issue. But by concentrating on what I'm calling nature and what I'm calling tradition, I hope that we can steer towards those deeper levels of Corbusier's work. Can I have the lights off and the first two images? Now, These are, of course, just a couple of images. On the left, the Parliament building in Chandigarh, designed in the mid-1950s. And on the right, one of Corbusier's sketches from history, the Riddle of the Sphinx, one of those drawings which is somehow a self-portrait, it seems to me, because Le Corbusier does leave many smoke screens and makes it rather hard on occasion for us to penetrate, perhaps, to what his thoughts really were. But let me say, with these images on the screen together, a few words about these two notions of tradition and of nature. It was Le Corbusier himself, the supreme breaker of rules, the supreme modernist, as we like to say, who declared in 1929, "Today I am accused of being a revolutionary, yet I confess to having had only one master, the past, and only one discipline, the study of the past." So what does he mean by this? How can it be that this so-called master of modern architecture could say such a thing? And what does he mean by the past in this particular way? Corbusier's idea of tradition was a complex one. On the one hand, like many thinkers of his generation, he absorbed notions of progress, of historicism, of the notion of the spirit of the times, of the conception that history was moving forward and that one must find forms that were somehow appropriate to that historical world process. But there was another level, perhaps you might say contradictory, except that I think we must start off with the idea that an artist of this kind can work with polarities in his thought. But another idea, one which is intrinsic to vers une architecture, towards new architecture, namely the notion that there is within the art of architecture an unchanging substratum, that there are constants, and that the great works of the past reveal those constants, and that one has to penetrate through to the essence, if you will, of the art of architecture, through a deep understanding of tradition, and then, this is the catch, transform those deep lessons into a terminology addressing the realities, the technologies, the demands, the myths, even the fantasies of the present. And I use that word transform because transforming was of the essence, really, of Corbusier's method. He was the supreme magician. When we examine his way of dealing with history, I think we are struck, particularly through the evidence left by sketches, connections through sketches, by the capacity that this particular architect had to seek out analogies between things, to find connections. He stocked his mind early on through numerous travels, through intense reading, through careful observation with the lessons of the past. And these notions embedded themselves in his memory, gradually undergoing a sea change, emerging in quite different forms later on in his life. And even then, I would say there are many complexities to the situation. Corbusier was deeply concerned with the issue of type in architecture, meaning that is the generic, meaning that is the essential, meaning that is those qualities of organization which reveal the core of a culture through some extremely generalized forms, which are then absorbed and again transformed in his own imagination. He was also able to jump one set of forms from one context into quite another one, in a way that was daring, often confusing, and sometimes deliberately ironical. He is, after all, one of the wittiest of architects. And nourished by the complex metaphorical language of Cubism, he was able to combine all of these methods at once in his own architecture. So we should expect something fairly complex in his notion of tradition. Furthermore, he had the kind of mind which was not happy to settle on one particular period in history. It was an imagination which moved up and down the railway tracks of history, raiding certain periods and looking for common themes. A fair amount has been said in the last 30 years about his classicism, his interest in the classical tradition. But even this was a highly complex affair. Somebody who admired the Parthenon, treated it as the exemplar of all architecture, but someone who could learn quite fundamental lessons from a Rococo French hotel, particulier, who could also draw upon certain aspects of the Renaissance. It was a very private way of dealing with the past. And he was not limited to that, because obviously he drew lessons from Byzantine architecture, from medieval architecture, and part of the richness of his language comes, in fact, from these connections. But it was obvious that he wanted to absorb, to condense, and to combine. The other idea, which I'm going to be dealing with, is even more difficult. Nature. A big word, and a very big idea. Corbusier's notion of nature was, like his notion of tradition, a rather far-ranging one. Really, we're talking about, on the one hand, the creation of artificial order, architecture, art, and the need that this particular creator had to try and give it what he felt was the immutability of natural form, of, I should say more than form, of natural order. Corbusier had a sort of cosmology. He believed that there was an intrinsic harmony to the order of things, whether it be the shape of a leaf, the order of the planets, the mathematical rules combining the structure of things in natural phenomena, and hoped that architecture could produce an equivalent sense of inevitability. His notion of nature spanned all the way from social and political implications in his urbanism, the idea that industrialism was deracinating, pulling people away from their natural order, and that therefore part of the business of urbanism was to put them back in harmony, a kind of ecstatic and paradisical harmony in connection with the natural order, which he summed up in the essential joys of light, of space, and greenery. That obsession on the right in those diagrams from the period of the late 20s with, on the one hand, embracing technology, on the other hand, using it precisely to reintroduce the natural systems of order, all the way from the visual pleasure of landscape to the oxygen-giving power of trees, to a certain social philosophy, relinking the social order to the natural one. On the other hand, it was a question of course, poetics. The view through the window at the top of the ramp of the Villa Savoie, the fascination throughout his work with the relationship between the building and its natural setting. Then again, the notion of nature involved him in analogies, endlessly investigating the reason for natural form, the intricate connections between form and function in biology and in the order of geology. And so we find, again, another, I think, revealing statement on nature, where he says in one of his essays, yes, in everything, nature shows us a picture of flexibility, precision, and unquestionable reality in its combinations of harmonious developments, serene perfection throughout, plants, animals, trees, landscapes, seas, plains or mountains, even the perfect harmony of natural disasters and earthquakes. Man is a product of nature. He is being created according to the laws of nature. If he is sufficiently aware of those laws, if he obeys them and harmonizes his life with the perpetual flux of nature, then he will obtain for himself a conscious sensation of harmony that will be beneficial to him. So evidently, we have to do with two rather fundamental ideas in Corbusier's outlook, which were, you could say, underlying many of his attitudes towards what it was to be modern. This, of course, is on the right one of the diagrams from Corbusier's Urbanism, where he's making the analogy between lungs and the circulation of the city. And on the left, one of the plans of one of the late buildings, the Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, a building of quite complex metaphorical meanings to do with Corbusier's urban philosophy. And he has recourse, probably not particularly consciously, to an organizational method which links him to biology. But there are many other connections between his forms, his way of organizing buildings, and phenomenon in nature. So these are the ideas which I'm going to weave together this evening, taking you for a walk through some of Corbusier's thoughts and through some of his connections, more or less in chronological order. If we are to come to terms with the beginnings, or we should say rather the fundamentals or foundations of Corbusier's thought on both nature and tradition, we have to go obviously to his formative years. And most particularly, especially on the subject of nature, to the nature of his education in the art school in La Chaux-de-Fonds, which he attended as a teenager. At that period, of course, he was expected to go on into the watch trade, as had his father. And so he learnt the business of engraving, of basic design, of understanding the fundamentals of drawing, and encountered his first mentor, Le Platonnier. Le Platonnier, brought up on Ruskin, brought up on Owen Jones, brought up on Eugène Grasset, all, each in their different ways, theorists involved with the question of how the designer could understand the natural order, convey the same message to young Charles Edward Jeanneret, the later Le Corbusier. On the right, we see some of the numerous studies that he did as a young man of conifer trees, of the forms of pine cones, the arrangement or silhouettes of trees, because another part of the message that Le Platonnier transmitted to young Le Corbusier was that of an authentic regionalism. The belief, in other words, that just as Owen Jones had revealed that the Egyptians derived their forms from the papyrus of the Nile Valley, so a genuine regionalism would come about for the Jura, that part of the French-speaking Switzerland in which young Le Corbusier grew up, by abstracting the forms and indeed certain associations of conifer trees and of the local geology. This method then is something that he learned very early on, and we see it being transferred into the decorations, but even into the entire silhouette of Corbusier's very first building, of which I show you only a detail, the Villa Fallet in La Chaux-de-Fonds of 1905-6. We notice even here the tendency to try and discover forms of multiple readings, of multiple ambiguities. Are these trees? Are they mountains? Are they forms of growth, explosions of the seed? And then to abstract these mathematically into systems of design. And if we put it in those abstract terms and we leap forward to something like Le Corbusier's Modulor 45 years later, we realize that this was a basic manner of thinking, of trying to find the mathematical ordering system within a natural organism, its ways of order, and then gradually transferring, by analogy, these qualities into architecture. Of course, his formation bounced him off a number of major mentors in the period before the First World War. Auguste Perret and the theories of French rationalism, particularly the ideas of Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who had put the case for a kind of modern architecture in contradistinction to the mere styles, who put forward the provoking idea that there was some general notion of style which could be understood by penetrating the order of the past, and particularly understanding the nature of structural systems in past architecture. And with his first paycheck in the Perret office, Corbusier bought the Dictionnaire raisonné de l'architecture française by Viollet-le-Duc, and here he examines the Flying Buttress and remarks, obviously referring to a conversation with Perret, where Perret is saying, go for the carcass or the skeleton in architecture and you will grasp the art. Transposing this method of thinking, but not the form of the buttress, into reinforced concrete, Corbusier from an early stage became obsessed with the idea that a genuine modern vocabulary must, just as the vocabularies of the past had based themselves on structural systems, do the same, but using obviously different materials and facing different needs. So even this conception of modernity did not involve a complete rejection of the past. It involved a new orientation towards it. But this is only one level in what gradually emerges as a fairly complex philosophy of history in Corbusier's formative years. Another major element in it comes, frankly, from his travels. The famous Voyage d'Orient, the trip to the East of 1911, or 10 to 11, where Corbusier investigates the mosques in Istanbul and, of course, the works of classical antiquity, most particularly the houses in Pompeii, the baths, the Pantheon, Hadrian's Villa in Rome, but also, of course, the Acropolis in Athens. And as you know from the chapter called Architecture, Pure Creation of the Mind, written 10 years later in Vers une Architecture, to him this was the height of architecture. And the way in which he spoke of its classicism, however, was not something that we would find, for example, in an academic textbook on classicism. Nor, incidentally, is it one that you would expect from a follower of Viollet-le-Duc. because he speaks of it in terms of the heightened spiritual meaning of form, ideal mathematics, pure sculptural arrangement, touching the deepest chords in the mind. And it is these qualities which he then tries to abstract and transform into the system of his own architecture. A diagram like this, done at the time of the publication of the essays in Esprit Nouveau around 1920, and eventually published in Vers une Architecture, bears witness, I think, to that quest, because it sums up, I think, the view that he had of tradition, and particularly his attitude towards classical tradition and classical antiquity. A little collage, collection of Roman monuments, and then the primary Platonic forms, as if to say that by penetrating through this, one can get to those immutable constants, which he considered it the business of all architecture to work with at any time, although transferring it or transforming it into a set of analogies or a set of conventions appropriate to contemporary life. This becomes an essential part of the synthesis or struggle of Corbusier in the early 1920s. And even in the late teens, in a building like the Maison Schwab, 1916 to 17, we find him grappling with, on the one hand, the notion of an efficient contemporary house based on the realities of concrete and based on some of the most up-to-the-minute aesthetic notions, to judge from his connections with Germany, or even possibly from his knowledge of Wright in books. But at the same time, to create out of this private villa something with the overtones of a classical vision, one that I think shows very clearly in an example like that on the right, that particular drawing. A classicism for the juror, because he had read the writings of Singria Vener, a local zealot who believed that, if anything, the Swiss romande had its debts to the Mediterranean world, and that therefore an authentic new architecture for the region should acknowledge a certain classical base. But the classicism is of a most generalized kind, very obviously, as writers since Colin Rowe have all said. Although what has not been said enough, I think, is that as well as the obvious Palladian overtones here, this blank facade, the curious qualities of that facade, which may or may not have to do with a particular and relatively minor Palladian palace in Vicenza. But more important, I think, is the method of fusing typologies from various periods of the classical tradition. If this is a little urban palace, then this is most obviously a rural villa of some description at the back, where it opens out to the south and to the sun. But more than that, if we consider Corbusier's descriptions of the houses in Pompeii and the sequences into them, the way in which one finds gradually the axis, perceives the way through, finds cross-axes working through, it seems to me that what we've got here is an example of a procedure which on the one hand wants to be on the cutting edge of modernism, but on the other hand wants to be radical in the sense of going back to roots, going back to a fundamental archetype within the classical tradition. It's this dual aspect which achieves a high pitch or a high tension in the works of the 1920s. Because, according to what I initially called the standard modernist folklores, we know full well that we're supposed to speak of the machine à habiter with the Villa Savoie, that we're supposed to speak of the lightness, the airiness of the spatial conceptions that so impressed Siegfried Gideon, of various mechanistic metaphors, which are fairly obvious in connections like these. But as we also realize, there is another side to the story, one which lives in a sort of vibrancy of ambiguity in relation to those images of modernity, to do with probing the essentials of the classical tradition. Classicism understood, of course, in an extremely abstract way, understood in terms of types, understood in terms of mathematics, understood in terms of trabeation, basic load and support, and understood in terms of the need to create an equivalent for modern existence to that temple to the machine age, the Parthenon, which had so impressed him in his journeys. After all, one comes up to this building by means of a procession in an automobile, goes around to the back, and then enjoys a procession through the building. There is a memory, surely, of the Panathenaic procession at the Parthenon and that sequence of movement which had so impressed him in his early travels. There are many other connections that could be made between certain of the houses of the 1920s and the memories of the classical tradition from his journeys. I think with some reason, connections have been made between the Maison La Roche, for example, and certain qualities of the Pompeian houses. And obviously, as we know, in fact the idea has almost been dealt with ad nauseam by now, the Villa Stein at Garches may have certain connections to Palladian villa ideas. Although what I think tends to be overstressed in those connections is that really there are many other levels to the classicism, if you like, of the Maison Stein at Garches, beyond the use of the proportional system which so interested Colin Rowe 30 years ago. In fact, and this is, I think, a different point, it would be quite wrong in looking at the buildings of the 1920s to posit classicism as somehow being the rigid ordering device and modernity as being simply the free plan, purism, the sense of explosive and ambiguous cubist space. Both were aspects, as Corbusier understood it, of classical order. In other words, it is the fight between containment and a sort of rude animism which so interested him in the Parthenon. It is the fight between irregular and, one almost might say, picturesque sequences in the houses of Pompeii and their clear ordering systems which so impressed him. The same might be said, it seems to me, of the houses, or rather of the structures at Hadrian's Villa, which again so intrigued him in his sketches. Can we not begin to think, in fact, of Corbusier's use of the free plan, of his partitions, of paint, of the way in which he handles these things as equivalents to the chassis, to the bare structure of ruins which he'd seen in his travels, punctured here and there by astonishing views across landscape, creating effects of great ambiguity long before Cubism revealed another set of possibilities in the handling and compression of planes. So his notion even of the classical embraces, it seems to me, many levels. At the heart of Corbusier's vocabulary, of course, there is the domino. The domino skeleton worked out in 1914 to 15, initially as an instrument for town planning, for housing, redrawn in late 1929 with the benefit of 10 years of purist simplification to give you really the basic image of the skeleton, of the conception or possibility at least of the 5 points to be developed from it, the free plan, the free facade, etc., of horizontal layering of space, of an instrument which will be the instrument par excellence for the creation not only of a new architecture, but so he hopes, a new society. But even in this image, and I think the ideas behind it, its conception of purifying or distilling a structural instrument, there are reminiscences of 18th century theory, 18th century notions of history, of Logier, of the return to roots, to the fundamental elements behind, as it were, the classical system. There is here, of course, a notion of essentials, one which runs against the relativist tone of today, but one which Corbusier very much believed in. The conception, in other words, that there are Platonic ideas, that there are essences revealed within the history of culture, and that part of the exercise of the genius personality, as he thought of himself, is to recover those and to reinvigorate them in the new setting of a cultural renaissance, the new machine age. And I think that part of that notion is one where, if you like, nature and history come together. To Corbusier, the Parthenon was an act of nature. It was the sort of beginning of things. And similarly, when we deal with the notion of history and nature together, in Corbusier's urbanism, these two notions come into a new meeting or a new agreement. On the one hand, of course, there was the notion of a tabula rasa town planning, the most anti-historical idea imaginable. But on the other, when it came to formulating the imagery for his utopia, Corbusier drew on many, many periods of the urbanistic past. I don't have here the diagram of the ville contemporaine, that mandala for social regeneration created in the early 1920s. But it was obviously a highly eclectic diagram, something which put together New York and Paris, which put together futurism and the section of Chicago, which put together the French park tradition of the 19th century with a certain notion of a new kind of classicism. Even a detail here of La Ville Verte, the detail of the Ville Radieuse of the early 30s, The Redon housing, as has been said many times by many others before me, quite obviously draws upon the tradition of Fourier's phalanstère, and by dint of that, an arrangement at least which takes one back through Baroque town planning, or at least Baroque palace planning. But that notion, of course, is crossbred and fused, as one begins to sense in a diagram like this. This tells one so much about the metamorphosis that Corbusier's imagination puts history and objets trouvés, found objects, through, finding connections between the ocean liner and the palace, becoming the modern palace, flipped on its side to become the skyscraper, and so on and so forth. I use the word analogy, but it is also a game of confrontation. It is a game, in other words, which, in the putting together of two disparate and very different realities, classical palace, ocean liner, two unexpected objects, in the process of confrontation creates a new vibration and a new meaning, one which delights in ambiguity, irony, and a kind of frisson, an excitement of the unusual. This technique is, I think, quite fundamental to Corbusier's creative method in his paintings, in his sketches, and in his architecture. It's revealed also, and I think more than ever, in fact, in the post-war works. The 1930s had been a troubled period to Corbusier, one in which many of his tenets came under question, even from himself. A period in which he changed direction quite fundamentally, re-examining the nature of vernaculars through his contact with North Africa, of peasant culture and what it might mean in his version of the machine age, and conceiving, especially in his painting, a new way of dramatizing ambiguity through surrealism, through the poetic confrontation of opposites. It's something which emerges in things like the Petite Maison du Weekend, even in his furniture design, and certainly in the Bestegui apartment of the 1930s. These discoveries, and of course the investigation of another basic feature, namely the question of light and the sun and how to deal with it in the facade, become uppermost in the works of the post-war period. Corbusier's ruminations on how best to reintegrate the social order of machinism with this conception of the natural harmony obviously went seriously on the rocks in the 1930s. It was then that he had, I think, to admit to himself the woeful inadequacy of his utopianism for dealing with the real complexities of the situation. His dramatic, even slightly hysterical oscillations in ideology in that period, his tendency to believe on the one hand that a small elite would somehow bring about the general common good, his tendency to be confused really about the direction that history might really take, following even the rules and principles of the Villeradiers. All of this, I think, really led to a kind of fragmentation in his thought by the late 1930s. In the 40s, he withdrew into himself in the war period, coming out from time to time to try and issue his town planning proclamations to a small group of French architects in the belief that eventually a reconstruction would take place, and up until 1941 at least, trying constantly to build the city of Algiers in North Africa. The late works, when we come to them, strike me as having been rather little investigated in terms of their debts to history. There is perhaps even greater complexity or layering of ideas vis-à-vis sources in these late works than in the earlier ones. This is coupled with what we might call the ancient sense, that is, a feeling for the rugged constancies of ancient architecture. It has a lot to do with béton brut, bare concrete, something which became so banal in the hands of most of the followers, but which in the hands of Corbusier has a lot to do, I think, with the cult of ruins, with wanting to evoke the notion of a scraped building, a building which has stood there being buffeted by the winds for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Unité at Marseille announces something of this intention, especially the way that it rises above the ideal Mediterranean landscape. And never forget the importance of the Mediterranean when speaking of nature. He tended to universalize from his love of the Mediterranean landscape and to treat that as pure and ideal nature. The theorem, of course, of the slab but the slab which takes us back to the dream of the monastery of Ima, to the section drawn in 1907 when he traveled first to the monastery at Goluzzo near Florence and sketched that section, the paradisical section, the one of the monks contemplating nature through their private gardens here, walking out to their little belvederes, the views down to the cypresses below. This really is what we might call a Corbusian archetype, which he then embeds in his way of thinking about the dwelling, whether it's the individual dwelling, the Maison Citroën, even the Maison Schwab, going through many of the villas of the 1920s, or whether it's in the collective order of the public apartment building, where he combines this conception in the very section and fabric of the unité itself. I think there is something even a little self-conscious about Le Corbusier's Mediterraneanism in the early 1950s, as if he wanted to say that now he might take architecture, European architecture, back to its roots. It's always seemed to me that the unité d'habitation has to be understood in this spirit, especially, of course, the roof terrace and its connection theatrically to the surrounding bowl of the Provençal mountains. Or, again, the monastery of La Tourette, in much the same spirit. It is, I think, a building which reminds us of the observation made by the 18th century theorist Ribard de Chamoust, where he says, "We must return to the source, to the principle, and to the type." This is precisely what Corbusier was trying to do in both of his major religious works of the 1950s. La Tourette becomes, in one sense, a drastic innovation, a radical building. In another sense, it is an eclectic building, a building which is soaked with memories and connections with certain periods of the history of the monastic form. Here it is, of course, seen across from the fish pond, looking up, the view out in a westward direction, the great block of the church, the disconnection gradually of these areas of transparency, the coding of the different public areas and then of the private cells wrapping around, and here again the contrast between these hovering elements and the earthbound lump of the church at one end. This from the Œuvre Complète, this page, reminding us of the letter that Père Couturier, the Dominican father who was basically the client of the building, wrote to Corbusier saying, if you wish to understand the essence of monastic life, the unchanging aspect of monastic life, you must visit the Cistercian monastery of Le Toronnet, 13th century, where indeed you do find fundamentally a type with a church at one end and with the attachment of the courtyard, but the church a solid and very pure block. But Corbusier had his own notions about the monastic life and the ideal type. After all, it was, as I showed you in the previous slide, a Carthusian type of monastery which had deeply intrigued him. Or the monastery at Ima, however, would not have been directly useful as a prototype because of the very different arrangements required by the Dominicans for individual cells. Nonetheless, there were certain memories, let us say, in the section and organization of La Tourette which can be traced to the monastery at Vima. Otherwise, there is, I think, another memory which takes us back to Greece and to Mount Athos, to Corbusier's travels when he visited the monasteries in Athos, which tend to be read as flat platforms which then descend with jetties hanging out over the landscape, providing long views into the distance. There's a marvelous description in the Voyage d'Orient where he describes the monastery in just these terms. Memory was, of course, a quite basic part of Corbusier's creative method, as it is for any artist. But what strikes one about it is the lack of literalness, the reinterpretive power, and the way, once again, in which so much ambiguity is released in the contrast between the modern interpretation and the memory of the ancient type. Therefore, it is insufficient either to speak simply in terms of Corbusier's modern language or in terms of his sources. There is obviously a certain point in the chemical bond of invention when both are left behind to create a new order and a new arrangement, but where nonetheless the resonance, if you like, of the past building, the ancient sense, is still present in the modern organism. This is, I think, something which is felt strongly as a presence, psychological, perhaps one would say spiritual, in a work like the Monastery of La Tourette. It's a view through the ondulatoire, and of course a reminder of another aspect of Corbusier's late theory, and one which confronts us directly with both the problem of nature and tradition, namely the whole business of the modular. I don't need to remind you of the importance of mathematical proportion in the theory of Corbusier. It's quite central from the beginning to his way of conceiving architecture. In Vers une architecture, the whole business of regulating lines, the notion of, on the to Corbusier's travels when he visited the monasteries in Athos, which tend to be read as flat platforms which then descend with jetties hanging out over the landscape, providing long views into the distance. There's a marvelous description in the Voyage d'Orient where he describes the monastery in just these terms. Memory was, of course, a quite basic part of Corbusier's creative method, as it is for any artist. But what strikes one about it is the lack of literalness, the reinterpretive power, and the way, once again, in which so much ambiguity is released in the contrast between the modern interpretation and the memory of the ancient type. Therefore, it is insufficient either to speak simply in terms of Corbusier's modern language or in terms of his sources. There is obviously a certain point in the chemical bond of invention when both are left behind to create a new order and a new arrangement, but where nonetheless the resonance, if you like, of the past building, the ancient sense, is still present in the modern organism. This is, I think, something which is felt strongly as a presence, psychological, perhaps one would say spiritual, in a work like the Monastery of La Tourette. It's a view through the ondulatoire, and of course a reminder of another aspect of Corbusier's late theory, and one which confronts us directly with both the problem of nature and tradition, namely the whole business of the modular. I don't need to remind you of the importance of mathematical proportion in the theory of Corbusier. It's quite central from the beginning to his way of conceiving architecture. In Vers une architecture, the whole business of regulating lines, the notion of, on the one hand, guaranteeing visual beauty through composition and order, on the other hand, of mirroring a higher order through architectural arrangement. It's this, very obviously, that has led to an endless set of footnotes since the publication of Vickover's Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism in the late 40s, suggesting possible connections between Renaissance ideals of proportion and Le Corbusier's. In this, as in everything else, he was eclectic. He drew upon many, many sources, literary sources, in his understanding of proportion. I find it almost more important, actually, in this theme at least, or in this context, to speak of the modular as a kind of emblem of Corbusier's philosophy. It combines, on the one hand, and I think with the kind of humor which he often brought to such things, the notion of, obviously, an ideal classical man, an ancient Greek statue figure, but isn't he also somehow the French cycling figure, the athletic figure, a slimmed-down Monsieur Michelin, somebody who's just come off the test track on top of the Unité d'Habitation? Isn't he then a kind of popular poster figure that we'd see in a French cafe, but combined somehow with this conception of the ancient Greek figure? And then there is something, of course, mildly absurd about the modular, delightful in Corbusier's amateurism with mathematics, the way he cheats, incidentally, in some of his calculations, probably without realizing it. But the combination and fusion of the golden section, Fibonacci series, what does it all mean? It's a kind of private alchemy, really, not a guarantee of anything, as we know full well, and as Corbusier knew much better than many of his followers. In fact, I remember talking not so long ago with somebody who worked in the late 40s, in the period when the modular was all the rage in the atelier, and Corbusier was so annoyed at the number of very ugly things that were being done in the name of the modular. He would come and look over someone's shoulder and said, comment c'est possible que tu as créé ça, imbécilité, blah, blah, blah. He said, mais j'ai utilisé le modular. Alors, dis donc, stop using the modular for 3 months, which they did. So, the modular then is right at the heart of Corbusier's idea of nature in a more abstract sense. It takes us back, in fact, I think, to his formation, to his fascination with the ideas of Eugène Grasset, particularly, who thought that the business of understanding nature was to get the basic components of a natural organism even understand their patterns and rates of growth, understand their rhythm, to chart these and transform these into a basic design vocabulary, which you would push through a series of rotations, variations, growth patterns, in other words, fundamental mathematical combinations. This was an idea that intrigued him as a young man and which stayed with him. And it is, I think, a device like this which enables Corbusier to combine, on the one hand, the conception of the higher mathematical order of things, of music, of, if you will, an order which is being mirrored in architectural arrangement, with the down-to-earth complex texture of his late buildings. It enables him to reconcile these two ideas in his late works. There's the detail of the ondulatoires, as they were called, at La Tourette, which are indeed designed with the help of Xenakis, the musician, to create a visual equivalent to music, but also to create a frame over the actual nature, to cut it into vignettes, to make of that somehow a once-removed world, a world of emblems, so that the view out of the building takes on an almost surreal character through careful framing. So as we investigate the interweaving of these themes, I think we begin to see that for Corbusier there was this quest for what he thought was at least fundamental in design and in architecture. And one would not expect this to be a consistent philosophical quest. He was an artist, was somebody who freely interpreted ideas. He turned them around and twisted them to suit his own meanings. We sense, I think, something of the connection, we could say the sort of private metaphorical correspondences in his creative method when we investigate the church of Ronchamp in connection to some of its guiding images and ideas. Ronchamp, of course, was a pilgrimage church, and as anybody knows who visits it, its real dedication is not simply the Christian religion, but actually Corbusier's private pantheism, his private religion of nature, especially that setting, that particular procession through nature, allowing the building to play off against the horizons, against the very kind of landscape that he remembered from his youth. But there are many levels compressed, many images that come together in it. And even I think one can retrace, and I'm sorry for the bad state of this particular drawing, but one can retrace to the early 30s, to sketches like this, where we find him on a beach in Holland in 1931, investigating the connection between a shell and its structure and a boat. Of course, in French, the word for a hull and the word for shell are very connected with one another as puns. And in Corbusier's mind, there were indeed puns that work by sound, but also by image. And later on, when he comes to designing this building, and especially working out its roof system, one of the inspirations was a crab shell, which he picked up on Long Island some years earlier. And as he was gradually working on the form of the building and becoming interested in the idea of a sluice, the shell began to suggest certain analogies of structure. In turn, the wing of an aeroplane was one of the inspirations. Now, none of these are literal things, and how banal it would be if they were. Rather, we have something similar to the way that the best symbolist poetry worked in the late 19th century. Something which uses an image, but slips its meaning slightly off-center, that allows another kind of allusion through another set of correspondences to take place. And around the back, the sluice, the water sluice, these kind of curious private alchemical instruments at the rear, and the notion of a vessel of contemplation with light coming through the top. Where was the inspiration? Well, there were many inspirations, but one of them that was most conscious in his mind was the lighting system of the Serapeum at Hadrian's Villa, which he'd looked at 40 years before in the Voyage d'Orient. These doodles, which are done not in 1911, but done after the fact, recalling the connection, recalling the image in his mind, bear witness to his way of reading the anatomy of the past for a basic principle. In fact, I think this is one of the striking things about Corbusier's drawings, is how they diagram the principle of something, whether it's the way that a leaf works, the way that a boat goes through water, the way that light comes into a building, the way that a series of axes are organized in a classical structure of the past, the way a section of a monastery works. There's an immediacy, a capacity to go straight for the basic idea in the thing, and then, of course, to store it up. In that sense, drawing was not only a descriptive thing, a way of describing, but a way of drawing upon it and storing it up for later use. So there is, I think, when we investigate the form language of an artist like this, a whole private set of correspondences which we can begin to sense, especially through sketches, and which constitute a private universe and, of course, a private perspective on history and a private perspective on nature. It's not something, in other words, that can be dealt with through a sort of logical disquisition on the basis of texts or on the basis of what the author himself says. I don't think this gets to the heart of the matter at all. We can investigate also the Indian buildings, where both tradition and nature took on very special meanings for Corbusier. Of course, the task in this case was to create a new capital, a new city, Chandigarh, after the strife of partition, with all the possibilities, the hopes, and the forward-looking aspirations of the Nehru period in India, an independent nation-state after colonial period, and the need to celebrate democracy, to celebrate a certain progressive and liberal ethos. All this was these were among the reasons why Corbusier was employed in the first place. But I think there was another side to all of this. Corbusier realized that India, one of the most ancient civilizations, was in a position now to reassess its roots, to reassess, in fact, the meaning of its traditions, and perhaps to reintegrate them into a new secular structure. More than that, as we investigate, which I'm not going to do in any depth here, but as we investigate the iconography of the buildings and even of the decorative motifs used in Chandigarh, we begin to realize that he used especially the capital, to address certain pan-cultural themes to do with the idea of a liberated world, the idea, in other words, of the natural bounty being made available to humanity in general. And again, the idea of harmony, of the social order coming into a period of harmony with the natural order. These were private dreams, ones quite basic to Corbusier's ideology as an urbanist and as a social thinker, but they were surely given a new injection of poetry through his contact with ancient religious traditions in India, with folklore, with, of course, the very imagery of Indian architecture. There are many telling connections left in the sketchbooks from the Indian period. This, of course, is a view from the Parliament building looking to the Justice building in Chandigarh. And then little doodles here of ox horns. The taureau, the bull, had been a very, very basic image in Corbusier's own cosmology and has a great deal to do with his contact with surrealism in the 30s. When he comes to India, part of his mythology, I would say, was to celebrate the conception of ancient village traditions, of the power of the village, to reconcile, if you like, Nehru's progressive ideology with the attitude towards the integrity of village life of Gandhi. And we find him gradually working his way around and about images like the bull, images going back, in other words, to the source of symbols, going back to the basic experiences around him and beginning to realize the mythical dimensions in them. And finding here gradually a connection between a tilt roof structure of the kind you find in the Punjab for ventilation, for rain, for the scoop, and gradually sensing connections between bull's horns and these. And these are some of the forms which are gradually abstracted into the architecture, nature, and tradition. Or again, when it came to a particular structure like the governor's palace, which would have stood, if it had been built, at the head of the capital. Here it was a question of working out a suitable rhetorical headpiece to the whole pattern of governance, if you like, represented by the capital, Parliament on one side, justice on the other, governor at the top. And at the same time, much more than just providing a state capital for the Punjab, really Corbusier was doing much more. He was supplying a new Indian architecture, I think. This is the way he thought of it. So part of the problem was to find an appropriate set of resonances with areas of the Indian past. And it's always seemed to me that this particular building, there are many, many connections that it has, but it is a most ingenious reinterpretation of the ambiguities of space and of water and reflections in a Mughal garden. There are, I think, recourses here to extremely ancient images of authority, the column, which goes back actually to a form brought in from Persia and absorbed in the period of Ashoka, representing authority, or even actually certain Buddhist overtones in some of the imagery as well. But at the very top we find the crescent. The crescent, which a form which combines so many different resonances. The idea of the open hand, which in Corbusier's Chandigarh was related to the notion of the natural bounty, the notion of something holding the planets, holding the heavenly firmament up, the conception of an umbrella, but inverted, the Diwani Kas at Fatehpur Sikri, which itself was a brilliant and eclectic reinterpretation of a whole series of different religious imageries in the previous past of Indian architecture. It is, in other words, an attitude to tradition which is not literal, which is not concerned very obviously with merely the replication of images, but which is concerned, we would say, I think, with a certain nucleus of meaning which lies at the heart of a tradition. And just as in the 20s he'd looked for parallels between the pure trabeation of the domino and the essence of classical trabeation, so when he went to India, he took that archetype and looked for its parallels with the open pillared halls of Mughal architecture or the grid plans of temple architecture, and began to see the correspondences and connections. Why? Because he was, I think, celebrating a series of institutional rituals in these buildings, but celebrating a set of truly ambiguous meanings. The need on the one hand to be modern, and on the other hand to be ancient. The need to become part of the international order, at the same time to reassess the indigenous tradition. The Parliament building itself, this is seen from the Justice building, looking across these extraordinary vignettes that these buildings afford one as one is wandering through them. Must be one among the, I'm sorry, what's going on here? Must be among the richest of Corbusier's cosmograms, more than just a building, in fact an emblem of rich in philosophical meanings. Because, as we see from the sketches, there's the investigation of the large shaded box, portico, the assembly as a funnel with the spiral walkway, overtones obviously of various past architectures using spiral minarets and the like. But how disastrous to have made a reference to any particular religious grouping. This was out of the question. In fact, this is, I think, not sufficiently understood that modernism and its degree of ambiguity was a perfect solution to the problem of trying to establish a non-denominational secular state. But how to do this with nonetheless some degree of resonance with past architectures. It's something that's bound to come up sooner or later, incidentally, as a debate for the recent IGNCA competition in Delhi, where the architect using the winning scheme has adopted rather literally Sikara forms and Gopuram forms from the Hindu temple tradition. This is at a time of communal strife within India. This is something which will sooner or later be debated. Corbusier was very aware of this and aware of the need to establish, if you like, a set of images and associations, forms with a presence of their own, which would evoke the ideals of the liberal elite for whom he was directly working, but at the same time would touch upon, let's say, resonances, memories within Indian architectural and cultural experience. This drawing, well enough known, but the inspiration for the funnel form coming partly from power stations. But you know, it's not as simple as just saying, oh yes, well I want a progressive image, factories, Nehru keeps talking about factories in his speeches, so a power station, I'll stick a power station in the middle, now we've got an image. It's a little more complicated than that, because among other things there is a kind of chemical transformation of meaning of this into the new complex of the building. But also, and even in this sketch you can see, rather this view, you can see the enamel door just here. You begin to sense there are other connections. The scoop form once again on top. But this is a door which is all about the sun. It is all about the orbits, the paths of movement of the planets. And here and there, Corbusier lets slip his belief that especially the Parliament building should be dedicated to the sun. As he says at one point, modern man should be reminded that he is a child of the sun, but that the social order relies first and foremost on the natural order and it's being taken care of in an orderly fashion. This in turn allows him to create a number of connections with past fields of meaning. One of the ideas was that a beam of light should descend through the top of the funnel on the day of the opening of the Parliament, when the large enamel door is opened up and a procession takes place incidentally, a clockwise direction, a circumambulation, very similar to that which is taken in temple architecture, through a dark hypostyle hall. One enters, and then there would have been this light beam descending, touching the column of Ashoka next to the speaker's chair. The column of Ashoka reminding one of Dharma, of the beginning of the social order in Indian history, and of course an image rich in meaning and connection, both in Western architecture, the pantheon, the conception of a cosmos above, and of a microcosm within. Remember, there are clouds and other acoustic forms on the interior of the assembly, but at the same time, which reminds one of the renewing power of light in ancient Indian temple architecture, where indeed the beam of light comes at a certain moment and allows and guarantees the recreation of the world, reminds one of the first moment and allows the world to go on. These are the kind of sub-themes, if you like, or substructures at work in the buildings in Chandigarh. Some of them are almost overt. Again, it's not a question of simply going down to the Jantar Mantar and saying, that's nice, let's stick one of those in, although we do know some architects who would do that now. But it is rather, I think, a question of coming to terms with the magic of a past form. Its presence, not knowing what it means necessarily, but then gradually perhaps beginning to sense its possibilities for transformation. The astronomical instruments in Jaipur, and incidentally the entire cosmic meaning of the Jaipur town plan, was something which intrigued Corbusier. With the Jantar Mantar in Delhi, which I show you here, he jotted down his reaction. And to me, this little note, and it's sometimes, you know, the most private observation an artist makes, not when he's coming on strong, not when he's selling himself, not when he's publishing, not when he's trying to convince, but when he's talking to himself, that has the most meaning. And to me, this pulls together nature and tradition in the way that they really were pulled together in Corbusier's mind. He's in his hotel room in Delhi 5 minutes after seeing the Jantar Mantar for the first time. The astronomical instruments of Delhi, he writes, they point the way. They relink man to the cosmos. Exact adaptation of forms and organisms to the sun, to the rains, to the air, etc. This buries Vignola. This buries Vignola. Well, so what I've tried to suggest here is that Corbusier's architecture involves many levels of meaning, that we can investigate him hopefully with the checks and balances of a reasonable scholarship, rather than creating the kind of novelettes which are occasionally cooked up about architects, but that we can investigate his architecture and discover that it operates in a variety of different fields of meaning and connection. I have not wanted, by speaking about nature and tradition, to minimize the fantastic inventiveness, the amazing commitment to social liberation, to progressive ideology of Corbusier's architecture. Maybe those would be tonics just now, in a period of slush, nostalgia, loss of nerve, trivialization, and candy floss in architecture. How nice it would be to find an architect that would be willing to speak of ethical concerns, of the cutting edge, if you like, of architecture as a moral choice and as a moral and aesthetic intervention in the social order. All of that is important too, and we must never lose sight of it with Corbusier. But what I have wanted to do is try and remove Corbusier a little bit from what I began with at the start, the sort of platitudes which can only too easily encrust him. He's so much more interesting an architect than Gideon and co. made him out to be. They had to box him in, really, to make him fit. Just as it's preposterous, in fact absurd, to speak of the international style in connection with Corbusier. This, to me, is a complete trivialization of everything that Corbusier stood for, and it's always struck me as even amusing that just when that idea, which has been done to death, was canonized in 1932, Corbusier, for at least 2 years, had been moving into quite different expressive territories in the early designs for the house at Mat, going towards a kind of modern regionalism for the Mediterranean in those buildings. He never has fitted in, really, to the slippery categories which modernist criticism have tried to bracket him with. Nor, incidentally, do I believe that any of the truly interesting modern architects have either. So part of the task is one of a new intellectual archaeology, a digging up, a throwing out, a reassessment. And I think this is going on in many places, and hopefully in some small way I've been able to contribute to that in work I've done. But the other side of it is very obviously no amount of throwing eggs and rotten fruit at Corbusier and trying to blame him for everything that's gone wrong is really going to make that much difference to him. He's made of much stronger stuff than that. He will go on for a long time, I think, after the brouhaha is over. What will emerge is not for me to say, because I would say this: every generation looks at its past in a different way. That Corbusier will be open to many other reassessments and reevaluations. That kind of private dialogue that takes place between an artist in one generation and a work of art that was created in another will always occur in unexpected and remarkable ways. And that is the key electric transmission of true tradition. That's the way it really works, is in that private dialogue that's then carried on to become the public gesture and act of architecture at some later time. And it's obvious to me that Corbusier continues to be a major world influence in architecture. There's no getting away from him, if you like. He bars the way to the past with a fiery sword. We can't even look at tradition without dealing with him in some way or another. Because he has changed the ground rules, it seems to me, by which we look not only at the problem of modernity, but also at the longer range issue of incorporating the past. There are many things wrong with Corbusier's architecture, but I have decided not to talk about them. Everybody has their own point of view. I think about his failures. He's always struck me as being rather weak in the use of materials, as a matter of fact. One day I'll give a lecture on that, on the failure of craft in some of Corbusier's buildings. But there are obviously things that are dictatorial, deterministic, and even preposterous in his urban thinking. All of this we know. But it is the buildings and their strength which somehow live on. One can reject the ideology surrounding a work of art. One can even, I think, reject many of its social propositions. But certain works of architecture have a capacity to live on, even with their faults. Corbusier's architecture, I would venture to suggest, will probably have that longevity. It is something which is mysterious. It has to do with the symbolic pregnance of great architecture. It has to do, in other words, with a capacity to even outlive the framework of reference and the framework of meaning within which the thing was created. Dare we use the word timeless? Perhaps that is a quality which exists here and there, at least, in some of Corbusier's buildings. But here I think we come to, I don't know if it's a paradox or not, but it strikes me that it is precisely in proportion, to the extent at least, that Corbusier was able to penetrate tradition at a deep level and penetrate his version at least of the natural order, that his architecture will have a long-range future. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I can try answer them. Yep. Corbusier's attitude about the people he saw following him while he was still alive. Yes, I can say a word or two about that. In the early 1950s, one of Corbusier's groupies who was working in the atelier with him, who actually got on his nerves rather a lot, we now know, brought in a book of recent work around the world. I'm not exactly sure which book, but you know, the kind of, there's a certain style of book in the early 50s with very nice black and white photographs, a very clean plan of modern work being done around the world. And he said, look, Monsieur Corbusier, this is going on in Brazil, and you see this is here, and this is in America, and this is there, and this is that. And, you know, see this is modern work, and isn't this marvelous, and so on and so forth. And he looked through it, and then he was quiet for a few minutes. He said, c'est très moche tout ça. It's very ugly, all of that. And the other thing I would say is this. In 1935, Corbusier was invited to London by very fervent group called the MARS Group, the Modern Architectural Research Group, who were launching the modern movement in England. And he was invited to the opening of an exhibition where, of course, people had dutifully designed with strip windows and pilotis everywhere and curved partitions. One or two of them quite good, I must say, particularly Bertold Lubetkin, for whom he had a great respect, a Russian architect working in England in that period. But, he saw this and he did his stuff and, he held his drink and he listened to the waffle. And, well, there's another side to it. He actually went off with a girl to a hotel who'd been brought in by a dashing young man, but this is another detail. But then the next day, people said, well, don't you want to see this and want to see that? He said, all I want to see is Bertold Lubetkin's High Point Flats from 1935, because I think he understood. And then when can I see Lutjens' architecture? Now, I think Corbusier really understood the difference between those who'd understood the spirit of his work and those who were merely imitating the external form. It'd be interesting to know what he would think of Richard Meyer's work or somebody like that, I suppose. But really, I think he was very, very conscious of those who were extending at the level of principle and those who were merely making images, if you like. Terragni he admired, for example. I mean, he realized that Terragni had understood the spirit of the work and incidentally had understood the spirit of the classicism as well. And you see, I think this is another point I would make, because one of the things I've been saying at the end here is that, like it or not, a figure like Corbusier introduces into the field of architectural thought and perception a range of theorems, a range of ways of asking questions, which you can accept, reject. It's hard to totally avoid. Now, there's a difference between the sort of superficial reading of those things, syntax reading or just a reading of a device, you could say an aesthetic device, and understanding the core principle at work within it. And do you mind turning that off? It's blinding me. Can you turn that thing off? It's been terribly hard to deal with it throughout the whole lecture. Can we get rid of that spotlight? Thank you. Now, it seems to me that gradually, as the history of the last 60 years does get written, it's only just beginning to be written. Because what's happening is actually the toppling of a series of self-descriptive myths which were operating for a period, some of them exact, many of them imprecise. But as the whole thing gradually gets reassessed, without actually the strain, in a way, the worry of defending positions, which gets people into such anxiety over things, or attacking positions. Either way, you get tremendous distortion, as you would expect. But as this goes on, what I believe may eventually emerge is that it's not just Corbusier. You see, it's right. All the best modernists were also profound traditionalists. It was Wright himself who said, this architecture is radical in the best sense of the word, meaning, in other words, that it is what he called the cause conservative, that law and order inherent in all great architecture. Now that to me that's the wisdom of the situation. Now, I don't know if we're ready to absorb these messages yet. It's a period of relative frivolity in architecture. Well, at least in the West it is. But this will pass, and then these things stand there still. So what do you do with them? They don't go away that easily. Their propositions are more basic than that. Now, one reason they're basic is certainly that they've made, challenging reassessments of what changing consciousness is about, what social change is about, what the whole changing social order is about, as architecture always will. This is all true. But as I tried to say at the beginning, it's their kind of modernity, the fascination of that address, naturally begins to fade away because it doesn't even look modern anymore. It even looks nostalgic. There are many people working with machine-age images now, not as images of the future, but as images of the past. That level, if you like, floats into the past. What's left is form. What's left is either weak form or strong form. And strong form, to come about, is not just a matter of aesthetic intention. It's a matter of many, many other things being achieved, including a field of deep meaning. And a field of deep meaning automatically implies, to my mind at least, a deep understanding of tradition. It's just the way it goes. Now, what I'm coming around to saying is this, is that those architects who extend and understand Corbusier have nearly always understood all of those levels at once. Say in the 30s, someone like Terragni very clearly did. he managed to grasp those connections with the imagery of futurism, if you like, but with the imagery of the ancient, the sense of ancient order, the sense of the constants in the architecture. And probably the strongest followers of Corbusier in the last 30 years have done the same thing. And incidentally, they don't have necessarily to look like Corbusier. It strikes me that Utzon is probably one of the deepest readers of Corbusier. Kahn most definitely was. When Corbusier died, a friend of both Corbusier's and Kahn's went to visit Kahn in Pennsylvania, and he said, Kahn was almost in tears, and he said, well, what shall I do now? Who shall I work for now that Corbusier has gone? Now, he understood, I mean, are we going to say that Kahn was a pastiche of Corbusier? I don't think so. I mean, he understood a language that had been made by one man to deal with one set of meanings, and he drew upon it, but he also understood the ancient sense. So their minds met in ancient Rome. That's the point. And it strikes me, in other words, that a whole reevaluation of what this whole business of modernism has meant is gradually in process. I would hate it if the whole thing turned into, and I must insist, I'm not doing this here, I don't believe that you justify a present creation by simply comparing it to something, in the past. I mean, this is quite obviously not the case, although there are people who do that. They say, oh, well, I looked at this and he looked at that, so that's all right now. This is not it, because there is this question of a certain break. The real invention is something which draws tremendously on a tradition. Maybe it only moves a tradition forward a quarter of an inch, but it still breaks it. It still creates a new organism, a complete innovation, just as the great classical works of the past did, just as Palladio did. Profound, what a great modern architect Palladio was, in his time. At the same time, a profound traditionalist, and this is the point, I think. So yes, Corbusier was very aware of who was trivializing his work and who wasn't. Any other? Why not, yeah. Well, I think that's a very interesting question because, now the question, in case it's not heard, is do I feel that in other parts of the world people are looking at Corbusier differently and perhaps understanding, very significant levels in his work? You see, people look at their predecessors according to the problem they're trying to solve. In other words, you look for certain things according to what it is you need from them. And it's very interesting to me, for example, how little the late works of Corbusier have been investigated with any kind of passion in America, despite the fact you have a late work here. On the whole, for the last 15 years, it's tended to be the 20s. People keep going back to the 20s. They go back to that as somehow the golden age, if they're interested in Corbusier at all, that is. In India, for example, it's not so, partly because the works that came in were so powerful at a time when there was such confusion architecturally, in fact things had to start more or less from scratch, that these were probably too dominant as prototypes. But one begins to see, and this happens to be something of my present research, but one begins to see very clearly the difference between what we could call the Corbusian Academy in India, people using brise soleil by the mile, concrete scoops all over the damn place, and all of that. And those who've really, you could say, taken on board some fundamental messages from Corbusier and then striven for a genuine regionalism. They've tried to draw on what's really relevant in the Indian past and to make a fusion and, of course, to try and crystallize the contemporary meanings and situations of Indian society. And this has involved, as these extensions always do, love-hate. Because Corbusier is rejected for his inadequacies with climate and his inadequacies with urban space in India. But the form that it takes is, when I say inadequacies, I mean that his inability to deal satisfactorily with the outdoor room, or the chowk, or with the kind of enclosed, ambiguous space, which is what Indian urban life at a certain scale is about. But that doesn't mean that he's been thrown out lock, stock, and barrel. It means that certain qualities in his work have been drawn forward. It's very curious to me the way these things work. Why is it in Ticino at the moment that some of the sort of more primal lessons of Corbusier are being extended rather than somewhere else? In France, there's almost no interest in Corbusier whatsoever. They want to bury him. They don't know what they're burying, but they want to bury him. So, each place works quite differently just now in the contemporary architectural world with those prototypes. And that will eventually be the subject for some future historian to try and figure out Why? I mean, here and there in Venice, California, there's some understanding of Corbusier. One sees it, despite Shelley's introduction. He got here, one or two stray seeds flew across and landed in one or two fertile minds, nonetheless. Okay. Does that mean it's time for drinks, or is there any more questions? Yes, okay, thanks.